We will smash the like button on the seas and oceans. We will smash the like button in the fields and the hills. We will subscribe to the channel. We shall never surrender.
Okay, so that brings up an interesting point that I have to talk. I mean, we have to talk about this because even though this book is a comparative biography of Churchill and Orwell, Ricks goes into great detail about, especially the early part of World War II and the miracle of Dunkirk, right? So what's going on there?
Yes. The Dunkirk. How did they get away? Very interesting.
Yeah, what's going on there? So now I had a new understanding. I had never heard. I've heard like 7 or 8 theories. Now I have another one that this book brings up, which is that and this may be revisionist German history, but that apparently Hitler said after the fact the Luftwaffe was going to take care of him, right? Or somebody says that Hitler decided to let the Luftwaffe annihilate the
remaining British troops.
The remaining troops on the beach, right? And all that the tanks had to do was surround them. And I think it's Heinz Guderian even says, like, I was parked there for 3 days. We weren't allowed to advance. We had orders not to advance.
I had orders to stay where I was.
Yeah, like I never heard that before, and I've read about Guderian. I've never seen that anywhere else. I'm interested to know where Rick's got that because I've read several things about
was it a major organizational blunder?
Maybe new stuff has come out, but I know that basically. There was this, like you said, Hitler and Goering were cronies, like they were buddies. So, I guess Hitler felt the German general staff was an obstacle to what he wanted to do at best with the army. And so, but he knew that he could rely on the Air Force because it was a personal buddy of his that was running it. So anything he told him to do, he would do.
Of course, the German military had always,
even if he wasn't capable of doing it, he promised way too much.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And the reason he probably distrusted the army was in the German military, the army was always staffed by Prussian officers.
Yes.
Junkers who were again, the German aristocracy.
Speaking of aristocracy, right? And Hitler was nowhere near.
That's not his crowd. That's not his crowd.
No, he was from he wasn't even from Germany, right? He was born in Austria, right, in a small town, right, of a postal clerk.
It could be resentment.
Father was a minor functionary, nobody to speak of. Alcoholic,
resentment and distrust that caused them to lose the opportunity to annihilate the remnants of the British army at Dunkirk.
And then the other theory is that the British really wanted a negotiated settlement with the British because they really wanted to turn east and they wanted to give the British government a way out. So bye Churchill. Here comes Chamberlain again, and we can talk again. Or
that's
Lord
right.
Beaverbrook or whoever.
He did raise that point, and to me, that actually seems more believable because if you annihilate the British army there, you're going to have a foe. You're going to be fighting street to street, house to house in Britain.
Well, you're going to have to contend with their navy. Right. Yeah. So even if you don't plan to invade the island proper, you're still going to have troubles with, anything you want to do that involves sea logistics. So,
we have to sink the Bismarck.
Yeah, that doesn't even come up. He doesn't even mention that. No, he doesn't. He really doesn't talk about the battle for the Atlantic at all in this book, which is astounding to me because other Churchill himself and other biographies I've read of Churchill, that was the biggest fear that he had, was that he had a line. He had a line apparently somewhere in his war room.
Got to stay supplied.
That had to do with how much tonnage was coming through.
Don't starve the island.
And it went below that line for a period of time. And he was extremely worried that they were going to starve. They were going to be starved out.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and that would be the approach you would take if you really wanted to.
Kind of a glaring oversight on Rick's part. There,
Interesting.
it's not the perfect book. It has, like you said, it's 300 pages. It doesn't cover everything, and it's hard to cover everything. But
Well, I think the reason that he doesn't take into account really pivotal events like the Battle of the Atlantic,
we already know
that
them.
it's not even so much that. I think partially that it can be taken as given that anybody who's going to read this book is already broadly familiar with major events of the war. But he's really trying to get at his theme in this book is I watched an interview with him. He says this explicitly.
Oh, okay.
How does democracy survive? Okay. So, and these are through the lens of these two men, here are two approaches to the same problem, two ways of viewing the same problem. So I think that's why he leaves out and only includes the stuff that shows how Churchill's unique perspective as not really a warmonger, but yeah, he is an imperialist. He wants to keep the empire together. He's sad about Britain's declining prospects in the world, but also he's a man who's unrelenting, and this is what helps democracy survive in Europe. Whereas Orwell's take from the left is Orwell is deeply concerned about how the state can be kept out of the private lives of individuals. So Churchill is concerned about preserving democratic government. Orwell is concerned about preserving the rights of the individual against an ever encroaching government.
Yes, but at no point in this book, see Orwell. It's made clear that Orwell is actually a champion. He kind of roots for Churchill, right? Which is unlikely because Churchill's upper class and he's a conservative, and these are, he's about like retaining the status quo for the empire, all the things you just said. Why would Orwell be a champion of his?
Yeah, and that's a great point. Ordinarily, they would not be bedfellows that you would expect, but it sounds from the description of this book that Orwell feels, as many of Churchill's own political compatriots do, that he's the man for the moment. That Orwell sees that communism and fascism are two sides of the same coin, and that there is no alternative other than to defeat them. And in that sense, he is willing to make common cause with a man like Churchill.
And I think also, at least I can only infer it from its absence, but I don't believe that Orwell feels that Western liberal democracy is a threat to the individual. The state would not be a threat to the individual. He doesn't. I think he's more concerned about the corruption that's inherent in Stalinist communism, right? And he sees that, and having come from the left and being wrong. And one of the great things about Orwell is that he realizes when he's wrong, and he says it. He says, I've been wrong for 2 years about this, and now I'm going to tell you why. And you know what I mean? And he can change his political position
that is very
in light
unusual.
of new events.
That is he has a Bayesian approach to his political views. And that when it comes to, politics and religion are the same in that way, that they're deeply held personal beliefs, and that to admit that you're wrong about either of one of those topics makes you question who you are, or who you've been as a person. So it's rare to find the person who is so deeply animated by politics to be able to say, you know what, in light of the new information, I have formed a new thesis.
It's like Ava Gardner effect, right?
Yeah. Yes. So, and he really, Ricks does make it clear that Orwell is a booster of Churchill. He is a supporter.
Yeah. But he never thinks like, oh, there's going to be a knock at my door and the British police are going to cart me off in the prison. No. He's like, I have a gun because I'm afraid that there may be Soviet agents who knock at my door and maybe want to get rid of me for my operations all the way back in Catalonia. So like, that's a completely different thing. And so No, that's all. Go ahead. That's all I had, really.
So I think that the only other thing that I would add about this is that they have two very different trajectories at the end of the war. Churchill, his greatest moments are at the beginning of the war. His diplomatic finesse at bringing the Americans in, and of course, when Pearl Harbor happens, he knows that he feels confident the war is won.
So when you were talking about him courting the United States, even when he gives this speech about never surrender, which I believe is in the spring of 1940,
Okay,
because
before Pearl Harbor.
Because it's before Pearl Harbor, it's before the fall of France. Because he says, we shall fight in France, right? And
Right.
He says at the end of that, the never surrender is not the end, but that's the clip. That's where
That's the bite.
That's the soundbite. That's where everybody edits it, right? The speech goes on, and he says, "We shall never surrender. And even if, which I do not for a moment believe, this island or a large part, should I do this, Churchill? This island or a large part of it was subjugated and starving, then our empire beyond the seas, armed and guarded by the British fleets, would carry on the struggle until, in God's good time, the New World, with all of its power and might, steps forth to the rescue and the liberation of the old." So even in that speech, he's making an appeal.
Yeah,
to the
constantly,
Americans.
constantly. Yeah,
Always there. It's always there. He knows that he needs that arsenal of democracy. He needs that.
Well, there was a kind of a side story that Ricks includes, which was another piece of American history I wasn't familiar with. Who was the American ambassador to?
Oh, Joe Kennedy.
Joe Kennedy.
Oh, we have to talk about this.
Joe Kennedy's actually a malefactor, and
I had no idea.
He's much like the British aristocracy in that he thinks, hey, this Hitler fella, he ain't so bad, and democracy probably overrated, and that the best thing, and Britain is really a waning power. Best thing for Britain is to just throw in the towel, sign a peace treaty, and America should also sign a peace treaty.
I wonder if, I don't know how much Joe Kennedy admired Hitler as much as he was fatalistic about what was going to happen. Like, he's like, well, Germany's going to win anyway, so you're better off negotiating.
He's a pragmatist, you think?
I mean, that's the way it comes off to me, but he also comes off as just being a jerk. Like, he just sounds like a terrible diplomat. Like, if you excuse my French, he puts the ass in ambassador, like.
So why was he ever, and I'm going to ask you what you think, because I know the answer that Ricks gives. Why do you think that he was ever appointed ambassador?
I don't know.
Okay, it's because in Rick's take, FDR saw him as a political rival, and didn't want to run against him. So he'd rather have it peeing in the tent, or being in the tent peeing out, than being outside peeing in.
Gotcha.
So as soon as FDR was elected to his historic third term, 2 weeks later, Kennedy yanked as ambassador.
Yeah, and that's a great story. So he comes back to America, right? And he's going to have dinner with the Roosevelts, right?
At New Hyde Park, at the Roosevelt Mansion, which I've been to. It's very nice.
Really?
And he's going to spend the weekend there.
Well, possibly, right? So they're going to have
That was
lunch,
the plan.
and he's thinking about inviting him to stay the weekend.
Mm-hmm.
And then he talks to him for a couple minutes. He comes out of the meeting.
Well, Kennedy tells him all these things. He's like, we should cut a deal with Germany.
Yeah. Comes out. He tells his wife, he tells Eleanor, he says, I never want to talk to that blah, blah, blah ever
SOB
again.
Yep. Get him out.
And she, get him out. And Eleanor says, but we promised him a tour and lunch.
Yeah. He
And
said,
Churchill
"Give him a
said, I'm
sandwich."
sorry, not Churchill. Roosevelt says, put him in a car, drive around for 10 minutes, give him a sandwich, and get him the blank out of here.
Yeah. Yep. And that was the end.
I want to see that portrayed somewhere. Maybe it's been done before, but like,
so in a talk that Ricks was giving about this book that I watched earlier in the week, there was one additional line where he said that Kennedy would go on to be a thorn in the side of American foreign policy for years to come after that. So I don't know what that's all about, but
I don't either,
I'm
because
sure
I
there's another
don't.
interesting book there somewhere.
We don't hear about him in the 50s. I don't hear about
You don't
him
hear about him
Truman
until his son's rising fortunes
or
occur.
Eisenhower. I don't hear about him. Yeah. I don't know what that's all about. That's a blind spot. I'll have to find out something. That's a blind spot in my history.
I was going to say that the two men have disparate fortunes because Churchill's great moment is the time leading up to the war and the beginning of the war. But his energies diminish as the war goes on. And he also seems to be deflated because he recognizes that this is America's war, and that the space available to the British in it is really almost polite. And he realizes that they're not major decision makers. Their input is sometimes being overridden.
They're becoming the junior partner gradually.
Correct.
And what happens is the American military command comes over and they fail at Kasserine Pass. And the British said, yeah, we told you about that. And they're like, yeah, whatever. You guys have been fighting for 3 years. You haven't done anything. Like, you haven't won anything. You failed at Dieppe. You fought Rommel in the desert and he ran all over you. You surrendered at Tobruk. Your forces in the East. I mean, they didn't say this, but like, this is the attitude. Like, yeah, the British have been here. They've been fighting, but they're not very good. And the British were like, well, these Americans are green. They're not very good. But there's some grudging respect among some of the military brass in Britain. And they're like, well, those Americans, they make mistakes, but they learn from them.
Right.
But they're arrogant because they don't ask us about our lessons that we've learned. They're learning their own lessons, but they learn them quickly.
He highlighted one particular meeting between one of the early meetings between British and American military planners, and the Americans were caught flat-footed. They didn't have the data, they didn't have the numbers or the records at hand, whereas the British were very businesslike. Here it is, here it is, here it is. And it was embarrassing for the Americans, and they didn't let that happen again by Rick's telling. So that was part of that quick study approach that the British learned to grudgingly respect. Yeah,
it was like the one guy said, every time we say something, they pull out a darn document, every time, it's like, oh yeah, here's our study on that. Right. It's an interesting relationship for sure. The numbers are astounding. The number of Americans that end up being in Britain in 1944, in the build up to the invasion. It's just
and not particularly welcome.
I was amazed. Well, how could you? I mean, like, you have, remember, we fought a revolution over that, right? The Quartering Act, right? So when British troops were on American soil prior to the American Revolution, and they were like, well, they got to stay somewhere. They're staying in your house. Mm-hmm. Like, they're not staying in my house. Mm-hmm. Like, oh yes, they're staying in your house. Yeah, that's the law. They're here to defend you, so they're staying in your house. Yeah. Like, no, thank you. I'm starting to consider becoming a patriot now instead of a royalist. Like, that's not cool. Don't hit me where it hurts. Like, so. Yeah. Could you imagine? Like, all these wonderful British countryside either erecting like barracks everywhere, or they're sleeping in your house and possibly with your daughter, and
stealing your girlfriend.
What the heck? Something's going on, and they've got money. And it was funny. It was like the problem with the Americans. I remember this is not in Rick's book. This is something totally different. I forget the source, but look it up, put it in the comments below. The problem with the Americans, one British soldier said, is they're overfed, oversexed, and over here.
And over here. Yeah. Our reputation for being loud, boisterous, and rude
comes from that.
Well,
and here's the thing. Okay, so before speaking of outside things, there's this great series that if anybody's watching hasn't seen this, you got to see. And you and I've watched it. It's called War and Peace in the Nuclear Age, right?
Great
So
series.
I was trying to remember, you know, this quote, and it's not in Churchill and Orwell. And we were talking about how so many things have been misattributed to Churchill, right?
Many.
Churchill's like Einstein or
Yeah.
Shakespeare or Mark Twain.
Lincoln.
If you or Lincoln, you just say something and you're like, just attribute it to one of those five guys, and like, you know,
Yep.
you got a chance that you're right because they said so many things, right? No. So I wanted to check my source on this to make sure I was right. And it was when Hitler breaks the pact with Stalin, the non-aggression pact, and invades Russia, right? Churchill goes on the air and makes a speech welcoming the Russians to the fight, right? And there's this guy who was in the British Foreign Service. His name is Sir Frank Roberts. Great, and it's in the first episode of War and Peace in the Nuclear Age, and it's him talking. So, primary source to material. It doesn't get any better than this, guys. Right. It's not a historian talking about it. It's this guy being interviewed by a documentarian. And he says on videotape, and the guy says, Churchill made this speech, welcoming Stalin to the fight. And he said, or the Russians, people to the fight. He said privately, he said that if Hitler had invaded hell, he would have welcomed the devil as an ally against, and it was just funny the way he said that, that witticism, that kind of witticism. But there's one other thing about Frank Roberts that endears me so much. So during the Blitz, during the the Luftwaffe bombings of London, right? There was a lot of damage. So he talks about this one incident, and if I can, I'll pull it out and I'll put it into the video. But he says, we were walking after the air raid sirens had gone. The all clear had been sounded, and we're walking, and there was this church that had been bombed, and there was a policeman standing guard, looters or people going through and getting hurt or whatever. And he said, I'm walking with my wife. And she said, these are Frank Roberts' words. I'm not insulting his wife. She said rather stupidly, as one does at times like this, what's happened, officer? He said, and the chap was he's tall. My wife's very short. He leaned over. He said, mice. How British is that?
Very. Very. That's pretty
to minimize it, to just to minimize it and make humor.
Absurdist humor. I know it's
love it.
I'd love to think that I could be so clever in such dire circumstances when the country's being bombed from above and there's not much you can do about it. But so Churchill's powers are waning. He's a bit of a drunk. His ability to consume alcohol is legendary.
Well, that's interesting because the guy who replaces Joe Kennedy has to go to find out if he is. Right? Isn't that one of his missions, is to find out if Churchill's a drunk?
Right. And I don't know that that's determined.
He says that when the ambassador's name escapes me, but he says when the ambassador writes back to Hopkins is the name. When Hopkins writes back to Roosevelt, cables him or whatever, and says, he looked at me with a clear eye, and he said, and I think that, Rick says, I think that clear-eyed description went a far way to say,
exonerating him.
We can trust this guy.
Right.
He's saying
that would be a legitimate concern based on rumors that you heard, because throughout the book, it's in every book I've ever read about him, it's repeated just how much he would drink at the beginning of the day, the middle of the day, the end of the day, and how he managed to absorb all of that and one, not die, and two, be sober enough to get things done. There must have been something slightly unique about his metabolism. I don't know, but so anyway, this begins to catch up with him a bit, and he sees the end of British dominance, and he has to preside over that as national leader, which is very hard for him. And then, of course, at the end of the war, he suffers a humiliating rebuke from the
Oh my gosh.
British public. Here's the man who's been our steadfast guide through the war, the light that we followed, and the man who bolstered our sagging spirits. But yeah, we don't want him.
The war's not even over yet. The war in Europe has ended, but VJ Day hasn't happened yet. And it's
I have to
cut off.
I have to attribute that. It's got to be another very British thing, because it would be hard to imagine the American polity at that time abandoning the equivalent of an FDR.
No, FDR had to die. That was the only way. There was no way that FDR was ever going to be elected out of office. He would have been an American Caesar, like he would have been some weird. I mean, the fact that FDR is elected for 4 terms, and we could go on.
Well, and this is why we have a constitutional amendment now.
Yeah, you just can't. That cult of personality thing just has.
It's not good.
You can't.
And we knew that. Apparently, we came together and all agreed that that was not a good thing.
It's the thing. It's like democracies. We need opposition. We need that opposition part. You have to have 2 diverging points of view. It's the duty of a strong opposition to exist.
Right.
You have to be there, and you're a player. And in parliamentary governments, that's widely known. In the American 2-party system, that is becoming less acceptable to some people who think. But we can see Orwell warns us of the danger of the 1-party system.
Correct.
He warns us clearly about this.
Yep. Absolutely, and that's his critique of communism. And so, to wrap up Churchill is his greatest moments are during the war. He is less of a figure towards the end. He has kind of an ignominious end before the war is even concluded. And Orwell's on a different trajectory. His trajectory is actually upward, because he's been a middling writer of no great fame or note, and really hasn't even written anything that amazing. I mean, Rick says he likes some of his things like Ode to Catalonia and 1 or 2 other things, but he's more enamored of his essays. But of course, his greatest notoriety comes post-war, in writing first Animal Farm and then 1984, which came out. Do you remember what year 1984 was published? It was the late 40s.
I can find out right here. I have the book.
I'm thinking 48, something like that.
Sounds about right. Oh, one last thing about Churchill before we gloss over. He wore, I did not know this, but I found out that he wore pink silk underwear when he was at the White House.
Why not be comfortable? Why not be comfortable?
Rix tells me that. Yeah, but why pink?
Pink is not a choice. I would agree.
1949. Animal Farm is 45, and so
I'm off by you.
4 is 49.
So yeah, and this is again where the 2 comparisons are not really obvious as to why you have these 2 folks together. Churchill's impact on the world doesn't really extend beyond World War II.
Well, maybe.
No, you don't think
so he gives that great speech. It ends up being in St. Louis. He probably gave it a lot of places.
From Trieste, the Baltic. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You got it. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic.
There you go.
And Iron Curtain has descended over the continent. Also, he has another speech where he talks about, I think he's in Parliament. He may be, I'm not sure. It's in War and Peace in the Nuclear Age, so I can probably pull it out. But he says, I can actually see him like doing this, and he says, Europe. I don't know if he says Western Europe. He says Europe would be communized like Czechoslovakia, and London under bombardment, certainly, were it not for the deterrent power of the atomic bomb in the hands of the United States. So, because that's what that documentary is all about.
I was going to say that's the setup for the rest of the show.
Yeah, that's what it's all about. And And that's where we learned our lesson, right? So that's Munich, right? So we all would do not deal with an aggressor. You do not, that's where that thing comes from.
Yeah.
It's a lesson that we learned, and we applied to our so at the end, Churchill becomes a mouthpiece to that non-appeasement of an aggressor, and Orwell warns of the totalitarian state. So at the end, they do merge. Now, I don't know if Ricks makes that point.
No, he doesn't, because
I jumped to that because I know a little bit more about the 50s.
It would have been good if he had made that tie to bring them back together again. I think that's a really good connection.
Ricks isn't a bad writer.
Oh, I think he's leaving the dots and connecting them aside.
Yeah,
I really enjoy reading his prose.
I like his prose.
I think he's a very skilled writer.
Very clear.
I enjoy very clear. I enjoy reading his words, and I think that he probably took his inspiration from another Orwell work, which is one of his other famous pieces, at least to students of writing, which is remember what it's called? I can't remember.
But it's like a style book, and he talks about here's what you should do if you're a writer. 10 things. Put it on your writing above on the wall next to your writing desk.
Every student should, every professional, everybody who has to write for any significant audience would do well to pay attention to Orwell's admonitions. And I really get the sense that Ricks really praises it, and I think it was very influential for him.
Yeah, I get the feeling.
I think explains the style of prose that he has, which I like very much.
Yeah. Like Hemingway for me was the guy who taught me the short sentence, because I loved to read Fitzgerald, and I loved those flowery, long, paragraph long sentences, and showing off that I knew how to use words from the English language. I think a lot of writers start that way, but then you realize the skill that's involved with brevity. And so, Hemingway was like the razor, the sword, slash through the Gordian knot or whatever. But it was like, tie this together and this, and look how beautiful, blah, blah, blah. And now smash that down. You don't need all that stuff. Yes. So every writer needs that kind of editor. And so it looks like Orwell was that kind of.
Or in other words, you might say, you must unlearn what you have learned.
It's so true.
But I would argue that Orwell's had a more lasting impact, and Ricks really makes the case that when Orwell died, he was largely an unknown writer. He was certainly none of his works are considered part of the Western canon. But as time has gone on, his notoriety has done nothing but increase and increase and increase. And perhaps this is a warning to us that the fact that he is so cited and referenced in the last 20 years and with increasing frequency now is an indication that people are looking to him for some kind of wisdom and guidance, because they feel what's coming. And an indication of that is when the previous president was elected, everybody reached for 1984. Because a lot of literate folks felt what was coming and reacted in horror, and were looking for some kind of consolation or guide to navigate through it. And I will tell you that while I've seen 1984 produced as a stage production, I've never read it. I went to buy a copy. You couldn't. Okay, from Amazon. Sorry to admit that I would use Amazon. They were out.
Well, you don't like launching billionaires into space? I don't know.
No, I'm not so keen on that.
Oh. Did you hear about the 18-year-old that he took with him who said, I've actually never bought anything off of Amazon?
Really?
Like, did you tell him that before or after the launch?
He said that. Wow.
I don't know.
I knew he took a kid.
It was out there in the ether. I can't verify the source on that, but
let's assume that it's true. I like it.
It would be a funny ironic thing for an 18-year-old to say.
It would be. But for the fact for a major worldwide distributor like Amazon to be fresh out of all copies of 1984 at that particular moment, that tells you about Orwell's lasting impact, and that he's a touchstone for these fears of the incursion of the state.
Did you ever see the movie?
No.
No, with John Hurt and Richard.
I've
Burton.
seen bits and pieces, but I have never watched it straight through.
Well, have some happy pills or something, like your favorite dessert ready afterwards. It is so depressing.
That's why I never watched it. And the stage production was as well. It's there's torture. It's bad. It's psychological torture.
And the book is worse. So like, here's the problem with picking up 1980. This is my humble opinion. In picking up 1984 as a guidebook of what to do, it doesn't work.
No, okay? It's a warning.
It's bleak. There is no hope at the end. At the end of I just ruined the story for you. There is no hope. So
you're saying there's no room for like a 1985? Maybe it takes place in a different city this time.
2010. It's like 2010. Right. The
characters you've come to love, they're back and wackier than ever.
The torturer in room 101 or whatever it was called. Was it 101?
I don't know.
I forget, but there's significance to the number for some reason. It's in the book. Ricks writes about it. Now I forget.
Oh, and also Ricks points out the fact that the main character is named Winston.
Yes.
So this is another indication that Orwell
never made that connection.
Well, why would you? Because he actually points this out, that Winston is not a first name in England. There were no Winstons. He must have gone and researched this. He asserts there were no Winstons living in England when 1984 was written, other than Churchill himself.
Oh, interesting.
So I don't know if that's true.
That's really interesting.
But he really believes that he's patterning him or naming him for someone he reveres.
He also asserts at the beginning of the book that in his foreword, almost, or his very first chapter, he says that it is known that Churchill read 1984 twice.
I believe that.
So
I
don't know how he knows that. He doesn't say.
He may have either written that in his voluminous writings, or he may have said it to somebody who wrote it down because I'm with Churchill. I'm going to write down everything he says. Maybe I can get a book out of it.
It's a good point. So here's the thing with Animal Farm, and this is a point that Ricks makes, which is a great point I never really thought about. Animal Farm is a fairy tale, right? It's even subtitled a fairy tale, right?
Right.
1984 is a horror story.
It is, yeah.
It's not it becomes a cautionary tale, but it's really designed to frighten, And
he said this in a book talk that he gave that I watched from 2019, where he compares and contrasts Animal Farm as a fairy tale versus 1984, which he also calls a horror story. He says it's the 20th century version of Frankenstein.
Yeah, he compares it, and he said that in the book as well, I think. Yeah. So, except it's not an invention of modern science, but it is an ideological invention, and that's the thing.
It is an ideological invention.
So back to the point I wanted to make long before, we were talking about these macroeconomic systems, right? Over the course of history, there's this idea, or there was, I don't know what the prevailing idea is because I haven't been to a university in ages, of history, but there was this idea that like economic systems evolve as mankind evolves, as humankind evolves. So there was feudalism, there was mercantilism, there was capitalism. There was like this, rampant capitalism, and then it becomes tamed. Some of the child labor is, and working 7 days a week is no longer, right. And then it sputters in the 30s during the Depression, and that something new must come along to replace it. And that ideal was there. Churchill didn't have that. Churchill realized, and there's another quote that is not in this book, and I do not know if it's true or just attributed, but I love it. It's attributed to Churchill, which is, democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others.
Yeah.
And even if he doesn't say that, it makes sense that he might say that because it is an evolving experiment. It's been an experiment since ancient Greece. It was an experiment then, and it's still an experiment, and it's evolving into what we don't know. We can look at Scandinavian countries and say it may evolve into some kind of socialism. We can look at I don't know. I'm not a great at political economic theory, but
well, I would be skeptical of whatever you would say anyway, because predicting the future is notoriously fraught. It's
right.
pretty much impossible, and any prediction you're going to make is based on historical precedent, and usually it doesn't apply because there are new factors. There are always new factors,
and that's exactly why 1984 doesn't work as a way to predict the future. It just doesn't.
Well, and Ricks makes this case that Orwell's concern is the intrusion. How does one maintain freedom, particularly freedom of thought, with an intrusive surveillance state? What he did not foresee was surveillance capitalism.
Yeah,
it's not even the state you have to worry about right now. It's corporations. Corporations know everything about us. We buy their products, which capture all of our information, can track where we are, what we're doing, when we do it. We've volunteered all this information, and it's a reverse of Big Brother. Big Brother's not trying to get in. We invited him in, and he's here right now. And it's not so much he's trying to control us. It's a matter of us radiating all of our information out to the world to then be used for whatever purposes it's going to be used for.
So I heard recently, I don't think it was in this book, but I heard recently somebody say, if the app is free,
you're the product.
You're the product.
Correct.
Right.
Yep.
And that is so true. And the idea that if you talk to us in 1984 as idealistic, at that age, say slightly like anarchistic, not in a political way, but like in an attitude, like, just like, leave your hands off of me. I'm young. I want to do things. Don't touch my stuff. Yeah. If you said I was going to carry a brick around with me, anyone would be able to track my movements, or that I would wear something on my wrist, which I don't, but that would track my heartbeats and my location, whether or not I was stressed, whether or not my heartbeat was irregular, I'd say, you got to be out of your mind. I would never wear a device like that, ever.
Lots of people.
Now we're lining up to pay people for the privilege to do that.
Correct. And so on the one hand, you have volunteering to bring this technology into your home, into your life. But at the same time, society is now constructed in such a way that you cannot be a fully participating member unless you do that.
I realized this recently.
If you say, so for instance, I was one of the last people to ever get a cell phone back when they were still flip phones. And I would tell everybody that, well, why don't you have one? Everybody's got one. I'm like, I want to have a real excuse to not be contacted. And once you have the cell phone, there's never any valid excuse for not being reachable. I want to be not reachable sometimes.
Right.
Of course, that was back when it was just a flip phone, a dumb phone, didn't do anything. It wasn't connected to the internet. You can still be tracked by cell towers and whatnot, but it's, big data
wasn't harder. Yeah.
Big data wasn't being harvested the way it is now. Right. And now, to gain entree to all the social media that we want to use, we have to supply bits of information, and we unknowingly authorize the collection of all sorts of other data that you would have to dedicate your waking hours from the minute you get up until you go to sleep at night to keep track of it all. It's overwhelming. You can't do it. Even if you're a smart person, you can't do it. So it's kind of you kind of give in, and you say, well, they've won. And you just hope that you have made yourself a very small target.